The headache arrived before the world did. Caleb Monroe's first sensation wasn't the ceiling above him, or the cold air brushing his forearms, or even the particular quality of silence that belongs only to expensive rooms. It was pain. A deep architectural throb that started somewhere behind his left eye and radiated outward like a crack spreading through concrete, slow and inevitable and total. His mouth tasted like copper and bad decisions. His body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled by someone working from a description rather than a blueprint. He didn't open his eyes immediately. There was a moment, brief, merciful, where consciousness existed without context, where he was simply a man waking up, nothing more complicated than that. Then his left hand moved against the sheet. The texture stopped him, not the sheet. Something on his finger, a band of metal smooth and cool that shouldn't have been there. Caleb opened his eyes. The ceiling was white. Not apartment white, not the kind that came in gallon buckets from the hardware store and went on slightly uneven and turned cream within a year. This was architectural white, deliberate white, the kind that required professional consultation and a different category of human aspiration. Crown molding traced the perimeter with the quiet confidence of old money. A chandelier hung at the center crystal, catching the early light that came through floor-to-ceiling windows to his left, fracturing it into small cold fires across the walls. He turned his head, and the room assembled itself piece by piece like a verdict being read aloud. King bed, Egyptian cotton, a sitting area where the leather furniture existed at a price point he could estimate but not comprehend. Art on the walls that communicated value through restraint rather than spectacle. Everything cream and charcoal and precisely arranged, the kind of space that didn't accumulate, it was composed. His clothes were still on. Jeans. A white button-down that had been respectable yesterday morning and was now a document of everything that had gone wrong since. His jacket was draped over the arm of the nearest chair with a tidiness he didn't recognize as his own. On his feet, his good shoes, his only good shoes, the ones he wore to interviews and Maya's school concerts, and the rare occasion the world required him to look like someone with options. He looked at his left hand. The ring was platinum, brushed finish, simple in the way that only very expensive things manage to be simple, the way simplicity became a statement when it cost enough. It sat on his fourth finger with the settled authority of something that had always been there, and the sight of it produced a sensation he had no immediate framework for. Not quite panic, not quite grief. Something anterior to both, a pure animal wrongness that started in his sternum and moved outward. Caleb sat up. The room tilted. He pressed both palms flat against the mattress and waited for the architecture to stabilize, and in that waiting the previous day came back to him in fragments, none of them connecting. The HR office at Stratton Financial. His supervisor's face, which had been performing concern while communicating something closer to relief. The termination letter, which used the word insubordination 3 times in 2 paragraphs, as though repetition could transform a lie into a fact. Walking out through the lobby with his box of desk items, a coffee mug Maya had painted for Father's Day, 2 years of birthday cards she'd made from construction paper, a photo of Lyra from the summer before the diagnosis. Her laugh caught mid-sentence permanent now, in a way it hadn't been when he'd taken the picture. He remembered the liquor store on Clement Street. The cheapest whiskey on the shelf, which he'd bought, not with the intention of getting drunk so much as the intention of having the option available of being allowed this once, to simply sit with how bad things were without being required to immediately solve them. Maya was at Mrs. Patterson's for the night he'd arranged that in advance, some part of him knowing he might need hours without being someone's father. After the liquor store, nothing. Not darkness, not blankness, but genuine absence, like a section of film that had been cut rather than overexposed. Fragments surfaced without narrative light music, the sensation of movement voices he couldn't reconstruct into faces or words, nothing that explained a platinum ring, nothing that explained this room. "You're awake." The voice came from across the room from the sitting area near the windows. Cool, exact, without temperature in either direction. Caleb's head turned toward it. A woman sat in one of the leather chairs backlit by morning coming through the glass behind her. For a moment she was only outline and impression. Dark hair, straight posture, the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting without discomfort. Then his eyes adjusted, and the details arrived. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with precision. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that were conducting some ongoing internal calculation, a jaw that communicated a history of not being moved by things that moved other people. She wore a charcoal suit that fit the way only bespoke things fit, like clothing that had accepted the body rather than accommodating it. On the side table next to her sat a slim leather folder, the kind that held documents requiring signatures. She was watching him the way a person watched a process not unkind but clinical. Her assessment neither hostile nor warm, but simply continuous. Caleb's voice came out rougher than he intended. "Who are you?" She didn't answer immediately. She reached for the folder, opened it with the practiced economy of someone who spent their days managing information, and stood. 4 steps brought her to the foot of the bed, where she stopped at a distance that was respectful without being cautious. "My name is Isolde Reeves." The name landed in Caleb's chest like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward through everything he knew, reorganizing it. Isolde Reeves, CEO of Reeves Global, which had interests in commercial real estate, clean energy, infrastructure, financial technology, and 3 other sectors Caleb couldn't immediately recall. One of 15 women running Fortune 100 companies. A fixture of business journalism for a decade, not because she sought coverage, but because her decisions were significant enough that ignoring her required deliberate effort. The magazines called her precise. The competitors' lawyers called her something else. The quarterly reports called her indispensable. She was standing at the foot of what appeared to be her bed, holding a folder, looking at him with the expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was now simply executing it. Caleb looked down at the ring again, then back at her. Isolde opened the folder and removed a single document, holding it toward him with 2 fingers, the gesture of someone delivering information rather than making an accusation. He took it. His hands were steadier than he expected. The letterhead was official county seal, formal typography, the particular grammar of government forms that hadn't changed since his grandfather's time. His eyes moved down the page through language he understood individually, but struggled to assemble marriage license, state registry, witnesses, notary. His name. Her name. His signature at the bottom, unmistakable, the same scroll he'd been writing since 7th grade. "This isn't real," he heard himself say. The words were quiet, not a protest so much as a fact he was testing against the available evidence. Isolde's expression didn't shift. "It's completely legal. Filed at 11:47 last night. Witnessed and notarized. I was drunk. You were intoxicated. You were not incapacitated. There's a legal distinction." She said it without apology and without particular hardness, the way an attorney states case law, not to wound, simply to establish the terrain. "The witnesses will attest to your coherence if that becomes necessary." Caleb set the document on the mattress beside him and pressed his palms against his thighs. Outside the windows, the city was conducting its morning business 30-something floors below, unaware of and uninterested in the particular disaster assembled in this room. He thought about Maya at Mrs. Patterson's, probably already awake, probably already asking when he was coming. He thought about the $847 in his bank account. He thought about Maya's cardiology appointment next Thursday, and the number the billing department had given him over the phone, and the silence in his chest when he'd heard it. He thought about Lyra, the way she'd looked at him the last time when she still had enough strength to be fully present, rather than managing presence as a performance of normalcy for his benefit. "You're going to figure it out," she'd told him, as if confident in his ability to navigate a future neither of them had chosen. He'd believed her because she'd been right about most things. He'd been trying to honor that belief for 3 years now, mostly alone, mostly adequately. Isolde was watching him process. She didn't rush it. "You have 2 options," she said. He looked up. "Option A." Her voice was measured the cadence of someone accustomed to presenting terms. "I have the marriage annulled immediately. You sign the paperwork here, walk out of this room, and $600,000 is transferred to an account of your choosing within 24 hours. No conditions, no obligations. You leave exactly as you arrived except with enough money to stabilize your situation. The number arrived with its full weight. $600,000. He let himself feel it for a moment, what that number would do to the specific shape of his fear. Maya's medical bills, the overdue rent, the medication schedule that required him to make calculations he shouldn't have to make. It would not solve everything. It would solve the immediate everything, which was different and also not nothing. Option B, Isolde continued. The marriage remains in effect, 1 year minimum. You and your daughter move into this building. You take the VP of Analytics position at Reeves Global, $180,000 annually. Full benefits package, direct report to me. You appear with me at required business functions and maintain the social appearance of a functioning marriage. In private, your life is your own, within the obvious constraints. After 1 year, we dissolve this through standard legal channels, and you receive a settlement sufficient to cover your daughter's medical needs through her adulthood, plus education and housing support. The air in the room had a different quality now. Caleb was aware of his own breathing. How do you know about my daughter? Something moved behind Isolde's eyes. Not guilt, not quite. More like the acknowledgement that she had been waiting for this question and had prepared for it without particularly enjoying the preparation. I know quite a bit about you, Caleb Monroe. 34 years old. Widower, your wife Lyra died of breast cancer 3 years ago. You're raising your daughter Maya alone. She's 6. She attends Clearwater Elementary on a financial hardship scholarship. You were employed as a senior data analyst at Stratton Financial until 4:30 yesterday afternoon, terminated for what your supervisor characterized as insubordination. A pause. Maya was born with a congenital heart defect. Her current medication regimen is costing you approximately $1,400 monthly. The cardiologist she needs to see costs more than that per appointment. Caleb's chest felt like something had taken up residence in it that hadn't been there before. You had me investigated. I've known about you for considerably longer than last night. He waited. Isolde was quiet for a moment, not performing hesitation, actually deciding something. He could see it in the infinitesimal shift of her weight, the way her hands, which had been completely still, moved once against the folder before settling again. You don't remember me, she said. I didn't expect you to. It was a long time ago, and I understand that the illness afterward— What illness? Meningitis. You were 14. There were complications. She set the folder on the arm of the nearest chair. 20 years ago, in the neighborhood around East Caldwell Street, behind the old textile processing building, you were there one night. I was 18. Something had changed in her voice, barely perceptible, like a frequency shift rather than a volume shift. There were men, 3 of them. Their intentions were clear. She said it without melodrama, the recitation of someone who had processed the event into fact through years of deliberate effort. You were 14 years old and you stepped between us. Caleb stared at her. You told me your name afterward. You sat with me until I stopped shaking. You took off your jacket, a navy blue thing too big for you, frayed at the collar, and put it around my shoulders because it was cold, and you told me to keep it, and then you walked away. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed something. She set it on the bed beside the marriage certificate. It was fabric. Dark blue, worn to softness, the kind of worn that came from decades of careful preservation rather than use. I heard through the shelter network 3 months later that you'd gotten sick, that there had been complications, that some of the memories had gone. Caleb looked at the fabric. Something moved in the back of his mind. Not a memory exactly. More like the shape of a memory, the space where one had been. A cold night. The specific quality of anger that had lived in him at 14, hot and directionless. A feeling of not being able to walk past something. I've been looking for you, Isolde said, for a long time. The silence in the room had changed its character entirely. Caleb became aware that he was sitting in a hotel bed holding his own marriage certificate, looking at a jacket he couldn't remember owning, talking to a woman who had kept a piece of fabric for 20 years as evidence that one good thing had happened to her once. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "So last night at the bar, you were there. I recognized you. The eyes are the same." A pause. "We spoke. You were coherent, and you were furious, and you were frightened for your daughter. I told you my situation, that I needed a husband for business purposes, someone outside my professional circles, someone who wouldn't have his own agenda to advance. You considered it. You asked questions. Eventually you agreed. I was drunk. Yes. This still can't—" He stopped himself, ran one hand over his face. Outside, a cloud moved, and the light through the windows shifted from silver to white, and the crystal of the chandelier changed its geometry accordingly. He looked at Isolde Reeves and saw something underneath the precision, not vulnerability, not yet. Something older than that. The particular exhaustion of a person who had been performing competence for so long they could no longer remember what the performance was in service of. $600,000, he said. Yes. He picked up the piece of navy fabric. It didn't produce a memory. It produced something else, a conviction, the way the body sometimes knows things. The mind can't access a sense of something having been real that he couldn't locate but couldn't dismiss. He set it down. No. Isolde's expression changed. Not dramatically, a slight widening of the eyes, a fractional recalibration, the look of someone whose model of the situation had just required an unexpected update. In the silence that followed, Caleb understood that she had prepared for most outcomes, but not this one. People did not say no to $600,000. That was the assumption that had organized her morning. "Mr. Monroe." "Caleb." He stood, his legs held. "I don't take money for mistakes. Not for any amount." He looked at her directly, which seemed to cost something, not fear, but the effort of being completely clear. "It would teach my daughter that desperation is an excuse to sell what you can't get back. I won't do that." He paused. "Give me a real job. Work I can do, work I can be proud of, work that justifies the title. Then we can talk about the rest." Isolde looked at him for a long moment. The calculation in her eyes was still running, but something had entered it. A new variable she was integrating, and the process was visible in the slight change of her posture, something relaxing that had been held rigid. "VP of Analytics," she said finally. $180,000 annually. Full benefits. You report directly to me, and I will expect results commensurate with the position." A beat. "The marriage remains. We negotiate remaining terms today." He extended his hand. Her grip was firm, brief, professional. But before she released it, he said, "One condition." She waited. "Maya's medical expenses I pay 20%. I contribute. I don't take charity." Isolde Reeves looked at him across the handshake, and for the first time since he'd woken up, the Ice Queen economy of her expression broke along a single fault line. Not warmth. Not yet. Something that might become warmth under different conditions if handled carefully, if given time. Her lips moved into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. 20%. Agreed. The subway ride back to his apartment took 23 minutes. Caleb stood holding the overhead bar, watching the stations pass his mind, running through the same territory repeatedly without arriving anywhere new. He had just agreed to move into a billionaire's apartment for a year. He had just accepted a position he was qualified for but hadn't applied for. He was wearing a wedding ring he didn't remember receiving. He was going home to explain this to a 6-year-old. The building on Ferris Street was 4 floors of a structure that had been run down when he'd moved in 6 years ago and had progressed since then with its own quiet momentum. The elevator had been non-functional since October. He climbed the stairs with the particular deliberateness of a man who had learned to conserve energy across a long day, each landing familiar in its specific creak and faint smell of the building's particular biography. He unlocked the door quietly. The apartment was a 1-bedroom he'd reorganized after Lyra died. A curtain across the main room gave Maya her own space, her own privacy, her own defined corner of the world. The furniture was thrift store and curbside, cleaned and maintained with the attention he gave everything he couldn't replace. There were Maya's drawings on the refrigerator held up with alphabet magnets, and Lyra's photograph on the shelf above the TV, the one from the summer before her laugh perpetually mid-sentence. "Daddy." Her voice came from behind the curtain, small and sleep-rough. He pushed the curtain aside. Maya was sitting up in her bed, a real frame now, wood he'd built from reclaimed lumber when she'd turned 5 because she'd asked for a grown-up bed, and he'd found a way to give her one. She was wearing the pajamas with the silver moons on them, her dark hair loose around her face, her stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. She had Lyra's eyes. She had always had Lyra's eyes, that particular quality of attention that suggested the world was a puzzle worth taking seriously. "Did Mrs. Patterson make you breakfast?" Caleb sat on the edge of her bed. "Oatmeal, with too much cinnamon." She studied him with the focused neutrality of a scientist. "You look tired, and your shirt has something on the sleeve." "I know." "Did something happen?" He had always told her the truth in the way that was appropriate to her age. Not the full truth, not the adult truth, but the shape of it, the honest architecture of it. It was something Lyra had insisted on because she'd grown up in a house where things were explained around rather than explained, and she'd understood the particular damage that produced. He'd tried to honor it. "Something happened," he said. "I got a new job. A good job. Really good, with a salary that means we don't have to worry about the same things we've been worrying about." Maya was quiet, turning this over. "Is that why you look scared?" "I look scared. A little." She tilted her head. "Around your eyes." "The job comes with some changes," he said carefully. "We're going to be living somewhere different for a while. At someone else's home." "Whose home?" "Her name is Isolde. She's my new boss. She has a very large apartment." Maya considered this with the gravity she brought to significant information. "Is she nice?" He thought about Isolde in that chair, in that suit, with that expression that communicated competence and nothing warmer. He thought about the piece of navy fabric she'd kept for 20 years. "I think so," he said. "You'll decide for yourself." Maya nodded, accepting this as the reasonable arrangement it was. Then, "Did something else happen? Besides the job?" He looked at his left hand where the ring still sat with its quiet authority. "There's more I need to explain. But some of it is grown-up complicated, and I need to find the right words first. Can you give me a little time?" "Okay." She leaned forward and hugged him, her small arms around his neck, her heartbeat steady against his chest, that particular rhythm he'd learned to monitor without being obvious about it, the way parents of children with fragile bodies learn to take inventory without the child knowing they were doing it. Steady today, fine today. He held her and let himself feel the relief of that for one unguarded moment. "I trust you, Daddy," she said, matter of fact, as though stating something so obvious it barely required voice. Those 4 words cost him more than the conversation with Isolde had. He texted Isolde the address at noon. Her response was immediate. She would come at 2 o'clock. At 1:58, a knock at the apartment door. Caleb opened it, and Isolde Reeves stood in the hallway of his 4-story walk-up wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair down around her shoulders instead of pulled back in the severe arrangement she'd worn that morning. She looked younger this way, less like the cover of a business magazine. More like a person who had made a considered effort to arrive as someone manageable rather than intimidating. She stepped in, and her eyes moved across the apartment in one unhurried circuit. The furniture, the drawings on the refrigerator, the curtain dividing the space, Lyra's photograph on the shelf. Caleb watched her face for judgment and found none. She was simply seeing. Maya was standing near the couch, clutching her rabbit, observing Isolde with the comprehensive attention she applied to new variables. Isolde crossed the room and did something Caleb didn't anticipate. She crouched down, bringing herself entirely to Maya's level, the charcoal-suited CEO, folding herself into the posture of someone who understood that children deserved to be met where they were rather than reached down to from above. "You must be Maya," she said. "Your dad has told me about you." Maya regarded her with the solemnity of a federal judge. "You're very pretty." Something crossed Isolde's face, surprise, clean and unguarded, the kind that hadn't been processed through any professional filter. A small smile followed it, tentative and real different in quality from every expression Caleb had seen from her since morning. "Thank you. You're pretty wonderful yourself. Are you my dad's new boss?" "Something like that." She met Maya's eyes steadily. "I was hoping we might be friends too. Would that be all right with you?" Maya's forehead creased in the particular way it did when she was applying full analytical capacity to a question. "I have 3 rules for friends." She held up fingers as she enumerated them. "No lying, no making promises you can't keep, and you have to like purple because that's my mom's color and it's the best color." "Those are excellent rules," Isolde said, and her voice had changed quieter now with a quality Caleb hadn't heard from her before, something that had weight behind it rather than just precision. "I agree to all 3. She reached into her pocket and took out the small piece of worn navy fabric, holding it briefly before returning it. "When I was your age, someone gave me something important when I needed it. I've kept it ever since to remember that kindness is real. I understand why colors matter." Maya studied her for another long moment, the assessment ongoing, the verdict still pending. Then, "Do you want to see my drawings? I'm working on dragons. They're hard because you have to make them look powerful, but also a little lonely because some of them haven't found their family yet." Isolde settled onto the floor beside Maya without a moment's hesitation, her expensive jeans on the worn carpet, her entire posture reorganized around the orientation of a person genuinely prepared to engage. "I'd very much like to see them." Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Isolde Reeves, CEO of one of the most significant companies in the country, sit cross-legged on his apartment floor and examine his daughter's drawings with what appeared to be entirely genuine interest. He watched Maya explain the mythology she'd constructed, the dragon Violet, who had lost her family but was learning to be brave, the golden dragon who guarded the mountains alone because he didn't know how to let anyone in, the purple dragon who could see in the dark. "This one is special," Isolde said quietly, touching the edge of the purple dragon with one finger. "Being brave when you're frightened is the hardest kind of brave. Most people only manage it when they have no other choice." "I think she's choosing it," Maya said with complete confidence. "I think she could run away, but she decides to stay anyway." After 20 minutes, Maya's energy began to thin in the way Caleb had learned to recognize a subtle deceleration, her words coming a beat slower, her breathing requiring slightly more effort than before. Nothing alarming, nothing that wasn't simply the daily reality of a 6-year-old whose heart worked harder than it should have to, but Isolde noticed. He saw her eyes track the change, saw the brief focused assessment that crossed her face, something sharpening beneath the warmth. "Maya," Isolde said gently, "would it be okay if I talk to your dad for a few minutes, grown-up things? Very boring." Maya yawned with theatrical sincerity. "That's fine. I'm kind of tired anyway." She hauled herself onto the couch with the practiced economy of a child who had learned to manage her own limits. Caleb helped her arrange the blanket and then followed Isolde to the kitchen area where the half-wall offered something that approximated privacy. "She's extraordinary," Isolde said. Her voice was low, private. The calculation was still present in her eyes, but something else had moved alongside it now, something that hadn't been there that morning in the hotel room. "She's everything," Caleb said. It was the most accurate sentence he knew. Isolde looked toward the couch for a moment, then back at him. "I spoke with Dr. Serena Wells this morning. She's the leading pediatric cardiologist in the country. I had Maya's records from the clinic transferred and Dr. Wells reviewed them. She wants to see Maya next week for a comprehensive evaluation." Caleb's throat tightened around words he didn't immediately find. "Based on the records, the condition is stable but will require close monitoring. Dr. Wells is estimating that surgical intervention will likely become necessary in 6 to 8 months. Between now and then, the focus is medication management and regular checkups every 4 weeks consistently." She said it in the same measured voice she used for everything, but she was watching him with a quality of attention that was different from clinical. "I know this is a lot of information at once. You did all of this morning." "I move quickly when something matters." A pause. That doesn't mean I'm not aware it's your daughter's life I'm talking about. It means I take that seriously." He looked at the woman standing in his cramped kitchen, who had arrived wearing jeans and a cream sweater to meet his 6-year-old daughter, who had sat on the floor without hesitation, who had heard Maya's dragons and understood what they were about, who had spent her morning on the phone with the best pediatric cardiologist in the country. The Ice Queen assessment was still there in how she held herself, in the precision of her language, in the way she processed information as if emotion was data to be integrated rather than experienced. But something else was threaded through it, something older and quieter, and it was becoming harder to look at her and see only the calculation. "It's not about pride," he said. "The 20%. I know." Her voice was even quieter. "It's about what you're teaching her." Lyra believed she said there's a difference between accepting help and accepting a transaction, that people who let themselves be bought lose something that doesn't come back. He looked down at the ring on his left hand. "I've been trying to hold that line." Isolde was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your wife sounds like she was remarkable. She was the most honest person I've ever known." He let himself feel that for a moment without covering it. She had a way of looking at people and seeing what they actually were, not what they were performing. She liked people who were harder on the outside than the inside. Isolde's breath moved a small, controlled exhale. "I think I would have liked to know her." From the other room, Maya's breathing had settled into the particular rhythm of sleep. They stood in the kitchen in the ordinary light of the apartment. Two people bound by a document. Neither of them had planned negotiating the terms of something neither of them fully understood yet. "Saturday," Isolde said, returning to logistics the way a person returned to solid ground. "I'll send a truck. I pack my own things." I assumed, send the truck and pack your own things are not mutually exclusive. He almost smiled. "Fine. Saturday, 9 o'clock. She moved toward the door, stopping once to look at Maya sleeping on the couch, the child who had just met her, and enumerated 3 rules and explained the loneliness of dragons with complete seriousness. Isolde's face in that unobserved moment did something it hadn't done all day. It simply looked. At the door she paused with her hand on the frame and turned back. "The ring. I can have it replaced with something more. I can get you something different if you'd prefer." Caleb looked down at the platinum band on his finger, the same ring he'd woken up to that had announced the shape of this new impossibility before he'd been fully conscious. "No," he said. "It's fine." He didn't fully understand why he meant it, but he did. After she left, he sat on the edge of Maya's makeshift bed in her curtained corner and watched his daughter sleep. Her chest rose and fell with the particular effort it always required, that small, heroic labor her body performed without credit every single hour. He thought about Lyra's last words, "Protect our girl, and when you're ready, let yourself be happy again," and about how the first imperative had consumed him so entirely that the second had come to seem like a different language, something he'd once been fluent in and had lost through disuse. His phone buzzed. A message from Isolde. "I kept the jacket. I'll bring it Saturday. It may help you remember." He read it twice. Then he looked around the apartment that had been his entire world for 3 years. The curtained corner, the drawings on the refrigerator. Lyra's laugh frozen mid-sentence on the shelf above the television, and felt something shift. Not dramatically. Not with the clean, emotional resolution of a scene in a film where a decision announces itself with music. Just a small and private movement, some weight redistributing itself, some door that had been not quite shut and not quite open settling at last into a new position. He typed back, "I may not remember that night, but I'm starting to understand who you are. See you Saturday, Isolde." He put the phone down and listened to Maya breathe and let himself sit with what he'd just agreed to. A year of this, of pretending or becoming or whatever the word was, for the thing that happened in the space between contract and reality. It was impossible. It was also already in motion. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. Outside the window, the city was settling into evening, the particular gray gold of a late afternoon in late autumn, the kind of light that asked nothing of the people it fell on and gave them, for a few minutes anyway, the dignity of simply existing inside it. Caleb Monroe sat with his daughter asleep in the next room, and a ring on his left hand, and a life that had, in the space of 36 hours, become unrecognizable in every practical way, and somehow improbably more legible than it had been in a long time. He did not turn off the lamp before he finally slept. Saturday arrived with the particular indifference of a day that didn't know it was supposed to be significant. The moving truck Isolde sent was unmarked and clean, driven by two men who worked with the quiet efficiency of people paid well enough not to require conversation. Caleb had spent the previous 2 evenings sorting through the apartment with the methodical attention of someone who had already done this once after Lyra died. He'd learned that grief and moving shared a grammar that both required you to hold each object and ask whether it still belonged to the life you were building or only to the one you'd lost. He'd kept almost everything. Some losses you didn't recover from by letting go of what remained. Maya sat on her bed in the purple dress she'd selected for the occasion, Mrs. Patterson's hand-knitted rabbit pressed against her collarbone, watching the boxes accumulate in the hallway with the focused calm of a child who had decided to be brave about something and was executing that decision carefully. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway until the last box went down, and then she pulled Caleb into a hug that communicated everything she couldn't assemble into a sentence: the years of borrowed sugar and watched-over evenings, and the particular intimacy of neighbors who had witnessed each other's hardest seasons. "You call me," she told him, pulling back to look at his face directly, "if you need anything at all. That little girl is special. You're doing right by her." He believed her. He held on to that belief for the duration of the elevator ride in Isolde's building, which required a key card and rose without sound to the 40th floor, where the doors opened not into a hallway, but directly into a home that occupied the entirety of the space and said so without apology. Maya made a sound she didn't intend to make, a small, involuntary exhale of wonder, the kind that bypasses whatever composure a 6-year-old has assembled. The penthouse ran from east to west in an unbroken sweep of glass and light, the city laid out below them like a topographical argument for human ambition. The furniture was the color of fog and pale stone, and the art on the walls was the kind that asked you to slow down rather than stopping you outright. Isolde emerged from the home office wearing black slacks and a white blouse, her hair loose. She'd dressed for arrival rather than intimidation, and the difference was legible. She knelt to Maya's level, which Caleb had now seen her do twice, and both times it had the quality of a natural gesture rather than a calculated one, the body's instinctive acknowledgement that this child deserved to be addressed as a peer rather than a small inconvenience. "What do you think?" Maya turned once in a slow circle, taking full inventory. "It's like a castle," she breathed. "Do we really get to stay here?" "For as long as you'd like." Isolde stood and looked at Caleb briefly, something crossing between them that neither named. "Come see your room." The room Isolde had prepared for Maya was not what Caleb had steeled himself against. Not pink, not generic, not the idea of what a little girl wanted, assembled from demographic research. It was a room someone had thought about. Bookshelves stocked with titles appropriate to a reader who was ahead of her grade and knew it. A window seat overlooking the city with cushions in a shade of deep violet. A desk positioned for both homework and drawing with the northern light that artists sought. And when Isolde opened the closet, there was an entire art station: watercolors, acrylics, charcoal brushes in graduated sizes, canvases already stretched to palette, still in its packaging. "I didn't know your preferences," Isolde said with something in her voice that was trying not to be hopeful. "So I got variety. We can exchange anything that isn't right." Maya looked at the art station for a long time without speaking. Then she turned and hugged Isolde with the full-body conviction of a child who had decided, and Isolde's arms came around her with the careful deliberateness of someone holding something they were afraid of breaking. Caleb watched from the doorway and felt the specific weight of a man standing at a threshold he hadn't chosen and couldn't quite step back from. The first week established its own rhythm before anyone decided it should. Caleb was at his desk at Reeves Global by 7:30 each morning in an office 3 doors from Isolda's that looked out over the same city from a different angle. She'd handed him the personnel files without ceremony, 24 analysts, 2 of them dead weight his problem to identify and address. He'd identified them by Wednesday through the data alone, not their attitudes or their politics or how they behaved in meetings, but through the simple observable fact that their outputs didn't hold up when you traced them back to their sources. He liked the work. That surprised him slightly, the cleanness of the surprise. He'd been good at Stratton Financial, but good in the way of a man operating at 60% capacity in a system designed to accommodate mediocrity. Here the problems were harder, and the expectations were stated plainly, and no one seemed interested in managing perceptions over managing reality. On his 3rd day, he'd found 7 systemic errors in the forecasting model that had been propagating bad numbers downstream for at least 18 months. On his 4th day, he'd found something else. The discrepancy appeared in the charitable fund allocation, $8 million coded incorrectly. The decimal placement wrong in a way that routed the money to a separate account rather than the intended recipient. It could have been an accident. The first layer suggested accident. But Caleb had spent years at Stratton Financial watching people arrange accidents, and he recognized the particular grammar of a mistake that had been carefully constructed to look like carelessness. He'd followed the thread one level deeper before stopping. The account receiving the funds was registered to a holding company called VH Holdings Incorporated in Delaware, beneficial owner not publicly disclosed. The initials meant nothing by themselves. But Caleb had learned long before Stratton Financial that the most useful thing about patience was how frequently it made other people's carelessness visible. He saved the file to an encrypted drive, closed the query, and said nothing. The breakfast situation developed without being planned. The penthouse kitchen was equipped for a household that didn't cook. The appliances were immaculate in the way things were immaculate when they hadn't been regularly used, every surface maintaining the dignity of its original state. The first morning, Isolde attempted eggs and produced something that communicated effort without communicating food. Maya, who was 6, and therefore merciless, in the particular way of children who haven't yet learned that honesty requires calibration, informed Isolde that the eggs smelled like the time a crayon melted on the radiator. Isolde looked at the pan. That's fair. The second attempt 2 days later went better. Caleb appeared in the kitchen at 6:45 to find Isolde standing at the stove with the focused expression she brought to board presentations, as though the eggs were a negotiation she intended to win. He moved alongside her and adjusted the heat without asking permission, and their hands passed near each other in the narrow geography between the stove and the counter, and neither of them acknowledged it. Maya, eating toast at the island, watched them with the observational patience of a naturalist who had found an interesting specimen. "You two are getting good at the teamwork thing," she announced. "We're practicing," Caleb said. "Cooking is just patience in edible form," he added half to himself, and Isolde glanced at him sideways, something shifting in her expression that he didn't fully read before it settled back into neutrality. The evenings arranged themselves around Maya's scheduled dinner, the particular negotiations required to get a child through homework, when the child in question had strong opinions about the relevance of long division bath, the question of which book, the longer question of how many chapters. Isolde had begun appearing for the reading. She didn't ask permission, didn't announce it. One evening she was simply there, sitting in the chair near Maya's window while Caleb read from the dragon mythology book Maya had selected as the current authority, and Maya had looked at her with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. 3 weeks in, Caleb came down the hallway at 10 o'clock and found Isolde already there, sitting on the edge of Maya's bed while the child slept, reading the next chapter ahead, so she'd know what happened. She didn't see him in the doorway. He stood there for a moment watching this woman who ran a multi-billion-dollar enterprise sit in the dim light of a 6-year-old's bedroom doing homework so she could participate in the story, and he felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. He went back to the kitchen and made tea and stood at the window and looked at the city and tried to remember the terms of the arrangement they had made. The conversation on the balcony happened on a Thursday 3.5 weeks after the move. Maya was asleep, the city below them reduced to its pattern of lights, and Isolde was holding a glass of red wine she'd barely touched. She was looking at the skyline with the expression of a person who lived somewhere without necessarily living there, the particular distance of someone who had built a home out of ambition rather than belonging. 7 families, she said without preamble, without the announcement that a revelation was coming. That was how many I was placed with before I stopped letting them place me. I left at 16. She paused. The system that's supposed to protect children primarily teaches them that they are the problem requiring management. By the time I got out, I'd learned to be smaller than I needed, quieter than I was, agreeable in ways that cost everything and returned nothing. Caleb didn't fill the silence. He'd learned early that some things required space around them to be fully said. Maya draws angels watching over her and dragons who are alone, but learning to be brave. Isolde looked down at her wine. I know exactly what she's drawing. I spent years drawing the same things, different shapes. She looked at him. Then the direct quality of it, something he'd gotten used to, this woman who had learned to look people in the face the way someone learned a second language, through discipline rather than instinct. You asked once how I knew she was special. I know because I was that child, and I know what it means to have someone see you when everything in your situation is designed to make you invisible. Caleb thought about what it cost her to say this, about the distance between what Isolde Reeves showed the world, the precision, the control, the quarterly results, and what apparently lived underneath it, this old, carefully tended wound that had never fully closed. What you built, he said carefully. The company, everything. You did that starting from 7 families and a system designed to make you small. I built walls, she corrected, and there was no pride in it. Walls are easy. I was very good at them. I'm still very good at them. She looked back at the city. Maya doesn't have walls yet. She has a quality of openness that I don't know how to protect without also diminishing, and I find that I want to protect it very much. He didn't tell her that he'd noticed. He didn't need to. The appointment with Dr. Wells was on a Thursday morning 5 weeks in. The office was on the 22nd floor of a medical building in Midtown, the kind of practice that existed at the intersection of the best available science and the resources required to access it. Dr. Wells was a compact woman in her 50s, whose stillness communicated the particular authority of someone who had spent decades delivering news to families and had learned to do it with full presence rather than procedural distance. She examined Maya with systematic thoroughness, reviewed the imaging that her office had obtained, listened to the heart, with the concentrated attention of a person reading a text in a language she knew better than her native tongue. Maya submitted to all of it with the patient resignation of a child who had been examined by doctors her entire life and had decided that stoicism was more efficient than protest. In the consultation afterward, Dr. Wells addressed both Caleb and Isolde with the balanced attention of someone who had correctly read the room without being given a diagram. The condition was stable, the medication was doing its work, the monitoring schedule every 4 weeks was appropriate and non-negotiable. Surgical intervention would likely be necessary in 6 to 8 months. The anatomy required it, the timeline was not flexible, the alternatives were not comparable in outcome. She said this plainly because Dr. Wells apparently believed that adults deserved the actual information. Under the table, Isolde's hand found Caleb's. Her grip was firm enough that he felt it in his knuckles, and she didn't release it until Dr. Wells finished speaking, and neither of them acknowledged it afterward. On the way home, Maya looked between them from the back seat. The doctor said my heart is working harder than it should, but she also said it's strong. She thought about this. Daddy's heart worked really hard when Mommy died, and it's still strong. Another pause, the particular rhythm of a child arriving at something. So I think it runs in the family. Victor Holt approached Caleb on a Monday 6 weeks in the corridor between the analytics floor and the executive suites. Victor was 46, a man who had built his professional identity on the specific authority of someone who had been in the room longer than you and intended you to feel it. He wore his seniority like a garment, and he had the unhurried confidence of a person accustomed to the leverage that institutional knowledge provided. He fell into step beside Caleb with the casualness of a man who had planned the encounter and was performing spontaneity. "Impressive work so far," he offered. "The forecasting corrections were thorough. Very thorough, actually, for someone who's only been here a few weeks. Thank you. Although I do find myself curious." The pause was architectural designed. "The timing is interesting. Terminated on a Wednesday, married to the CEO by Thursday night, VP by the following Monday. In some organizations that would raise questions." Caleb kept walking, kept his pace. "I'm sure it would. I'm not raising questions, of course." Victor's smile was the particular variety that didn't implicate the eyes. "Just noting the optics. At this level, Mr. Monroe perception has its own gravity. Best to make sure the structure underneath can support the weight." He nodded once and peeled away toward the elevator, leaving Caleb standing at the door of his office with the specific sensation of a man who has just been shown the shape of a threat and been expected to find it impressive. He went inside, sat down, and opened the encrypted file. The boardroom confrontation arrived on a Friday 6 weeks and 4 days after Caleb started. Victor had spent those 4 days building something. Caleb could see it in retrospect. The quiet assembly of allies, the conversations that happened slightly out of earshot, the way certain board members' expressions had shifted when they passed him in the corridor. Victor had been preparing, and he'd prepared well, and the fact that he'd prepared on false premises didn't make the preparation any less real. The emergency board meeting was called for 11 o'clock. 14 people in the room, including Aldous Pembridge at the head of the table and 2 board members Caleb had never previously met, which told him something about the level of mobilization Victor had achieved. Isolde sat at the other end of the table from Pembridge, her expression the compressed neutrality she brought to high-stakes situations, giving nothing away. Victor presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was holding all the relevant cards. The termination letter framed as firing for incompetence rather than whistleblowing. Caleb's financial records, the desperation legible in the numbers. The marriage timeline 3 days from unemployment to wedding certificate. The hiring timeline less than a week from wedding to VP. He laid it out as a logical progression, each fact accurate, the conclusion they were designed to produce entirely false. "This appears to be a calculated scheme," Victor told the room, his voice carrying the measured concern of a man performing reluctant duty. "We owe our shareholders clarity about who is operating at the executive level of this company and under what circumstances." Aldous Pembridge studied the documents, his face giving nothing. "These are significant allegations, Victor. What exactly are you proposing? A full background review, financial disclosure, independent verification of credentials and qualifications, nothing more than due diligence?" Isolde opened her mouth. Caleb stood up. The room's attention relocated to him with the speed of people surprised by the unexpected move of someone they'd assumed was cornered. He stood at his place at the table, and he was calm in a way that wasn't the absence of feeling, but the management of it, the way a person was calm when they had decided exactly what they were going to do. "You're right," he said, and the directness of it landed in the room like a stone. He wasn't looking at Victor. He was looking at Pembridge, at the board members, at the people who had assembled in this room to judge him. "The circumstances look exactly like what Mr. Holt is describing. I was unemployed. I was broke. I was watching my daughter's medical situation deteriorate, and I had run out of options. Isolde offered me a path forward, and I took it." He let that sit for exactly long enough. "But let's be precise about what I've done with that path." He connected his laptop to the room's display system, the screen filled with numbers. "This is the charitable fund discrepancy I flagged in my first week. Mr. Holt called it an accounting error in his presentation. It isn't an accounting error." He advanced the slide. "Wire transfers, amounts, dates, account designations. The funds were systematically redirected through a shell company, VH Holdings, incorporated in Delaware, over a period of 31 months. Total amount $2.4 million. He advanced again. "These are the authorization signatures on 9 separate transfer orders." He paused for the room to read them. Mr. Holt's signature. All 9. The silence that descended on the boardroom had a different quality from ordinary quiet. It was the silence of a room recalibrating, of people revising what they thought they were watching. Victor's composure broke at its edges, first a slight tightening around the jaw, a movement of the hands that he stopped before it completed. "Those signatures are forgeries. This is a desperate attempt to— To what?" Caleb kept his voice completely level. "I've been here 6 weeks, Mr. Holt. I don't have the institutional knowledge to forge your signature on documents dating back 31 months. But I do have the analytical skills to follow a data trail that someone was hoping no one would follow carefully enough." He looked at Pembridge. "I can walk this board through every transfer, every account, every authorization, line by line. I've been ready to do that since week 3. Aldous Pembridge looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at Victor Holt with an expression that had shed every ambiguity. "Victor, is there anything you'd like to say before I ask Sterling Cole to initiate a forensic audit?" Victor said nothing. His silence was its own answer. The meeting dissolved into a controlled chaos that Caleb recognized as institutional crisis management. Cole on the phone immediately, 2 board members requesting to recuse themselves from subsequent proceedings. Pembridge's assistant appearing at the door with the quiet urgency of someone who had already been briefed to be ready. Victor was escorted to his office, which would be locked within the hour. In the corridor afterward, Isolde pulled Caleb into an empty conference room and closed the door. She looked at him with something he had not previously seen from her, not the assessment, not the calculation, not the precision that organized every interaction. Something rawer than those things, something that had been waiting behind them. "You knew since week 1, she said. Day 4. He leaned against the conference table. "The data was clear once I started looking. But if I'd brought it unprompted, I'm a new hire attacking the CFO with 6 weeks of tenure. That's not a position that wins." He paused. If he attacked first, if he made it about ethics and character in front of the full board, then the response lands differently. He handed me the venue. Isolde looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the room and kissed him. And it was not the careful, measured action of a woman executing a decision. It was something that had been waiting longer than she'd acknowledged, and had run out of patience with waiting. He kissed her back, and it was real in the specific way that things were real when they stopped performing reality and became it. When they stopped, her forehead rested against his, both of them breathing differently than before. "This is complicated," she managed. "Everything about us is complicated." His voice was quiet. "That doesn't make it less real." She pulled back enough to look at him, and for once the calculation was entirely gone from her eyes, replaced by something that was just a person in the specific moment of realizing something had changed in a way it couldn't be changed back from. "I'm falling in love with you," she said. "Both of you. That wasn't the plan." "Plans change." He met her eyes. "Lyra used to say life laughs at plans." She was right about most things. Something moved through Isolde's expression at Lyra's name. Not discomfort, not resentment, but recognition. The acknowledgement that a ghost could be honored rather than displaced. She nodded once, and the nod held the weight of a commitment. The tabloid story broke on a Monday, 8 weeks, in which was the kind of detail that shouldn't have mattered, and did. Caleb found out when Maya came home from school in the back of Isolde's car with her eyes red and her rabbit held so tight against her chest that the fabric had creased. A parent in her class had shown their child the article which had found its way to the school, the way these things always found their way to the worst possible locations with the worst possible efficiency. The headline was not subtle. The article was thorough in the way that tabloid journalism was thorough, accurate on the verifiable facts, comprehensively dishonest about what the facts meant. Maya sat on the kitchen island stool and looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be 7 years older than it was. "Sophia's mom says our family is fake." Her voice was controlled in the way that children's voices were controlled when they were one wrong word from falling apart. "She showed Sophia the newspaper, and Sophia told everyone at lunch. They kept asking if I was being used." She stopped. "What does that mean, used?" Caleb sat down in front of her at her level. "It means someone who doesn't know our family looked at the beginning of it and decided they understood the whole story." "Do they?" "No." Maya absorbed this. "But our family did start in a weird way. The best things often do." Isolde arrived home 40 minutes later to find them still in the kitchen. Maya doing homework with the focused determination of a child who had decided that normalcy was the appropriate response to chaos. Isolde set her bag down, read the situation and said nothing for a moment. Then she crossed to where Maya sat and crouched beside the stool. "I heard what happened at school today," she said. Her voice was low and direct and had abandoned every professional register. This was Isolde speaking from somewhere that had no title. "I need you to hear something from me. Our family started in an unusual way. That's true, but unusual is not the same as fake. And I need you to know that what I feel for you and your dad is the most real thing in my life." Maya looked at her for a long moment. "Say it again," she finally said very quietly. "But look at me the whole time." Isolde held her gaze without flinching. "What I feel for you and your dad is the most real thing in my life." That night, after Maya was asleep, Caleb found Isolde on the balcony. The city was its usual argument below them. She was standing at the railing with her arms wrapped around herself, not against the cold, against something interior. He stood beside her. They were quiet for a while, the way people were quiet when words had been used sufficiently and something else was needed. She spoke first. "I went to her school today, before I came home." She hadn't mentioned this. "I needed them to see the parents, the teachers, whoever was there. I needed them to see that I wasn't managing this from a distance." "What did you do?" "I picked her up myself. I carried her backpack. I talked to her teacher." A pause. It felt like the minimum. It felt like the only thing that was appropriate. She looked at him. "I keep wondering when I became a person who thinks about what's appropriate for a child's sense of safety. It doesn't feel like a decision I made. It feels like something that happened to me." He thought about the way she'd sat on his apartment floor 6 weeks ago and listened to Maya explain the loneliness of dragons, how she'd gotten there without a map. "It happened in week 2, he said, "when you sat on Maya's floor and treated her dragons like they were real. She told me afterward. She said you were a keeper." Isolde made a sound that was trying not to be a laugh and almost succeeded. 6-year-olds should not be allowed to have that kind of accuracy. The call from Dr. Wells came 9 weeks in on a Tuesday night at 11:14. The sound of the phone in the dark bedroom had a quality that Caleb recognized before he was fully awake. The particular significance of a call that doesn't come at 11 on a Tuesday unless the news requires it. He answered before the second ring. Dr. Wells's voice was calm, which was its own information. "I need you both to bring Maya in tomorrow morning. The monitoring from last week's blood work shows some changes I want to discuss in person. Nothing that requires the emergency room tonight, but I don't want to wait until her regular appointment." He was already sitting up. Isolde had woken at the sound of his voice and was watching him from her side of the bed, reading his face with the full attention of someone who had learned to interpret his silences. He lowered the phone. In the dark of the room, with the city doing its indifferent business 40 floors below, he told her what Dr. Wells had said. Isolde was quiet for a moment that had real weight to it, the weight of a person absorbing impact they had prepared for and still weren't ready for. "What time?" she asked finally. 8 o'clock? She nodded. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, and they sat there in the dark, not performing composure, not covering what they felt with language or practical planning. Just two people sitting with the specific fear that came from caring about something you couldn't protect by strength of will alone, waiting for morning. Dr. Wells delivered the news the way she delivered all news directly, without the softening that would have been a disservice. She pulled up the imaging on the screen in her consultation room and walked them through what had changed the language, precise and unsentimental, the kind of clarity that respected the people receiving it enough not to obscure it in reassurance. The surgical timeline had collapsed. What had been 6 to 8 months was now 2 to 3 weeks. The heart muscle was compensating in a way that couldn't be sustained, the valve recruiting surrounding tissue in a process that was buying time at a cost that would eventually exceed the available credit. The repair that had been a future consideration was now an immediate one. Delay carried risks that dwarfed the risks of the procedure itself. Caleb sat in the chair across from Dr. Wells's desk, and heard the words arrive with the quality of something falling from a great height, each one distinct, each one heavier than the last. Beside him, Isolde's hand found his under the edge of the desk, and her grip had the force of someone holding on, rather than offering comfort, the grip of a person who needed anchoring as much as she was providing it. "The success rate," he said, 85% for full correction with normal postoperative recovery. "Doctor." Wells's voice was steady. "The procedure is complex but well established. I've performed 47 of this specific repair. My team is exceptional." A pause that carried its own weight. 15% risk of significant complications ranging from extended recovery to outcomes I hope we don't need to discuss in detail today. 15%. 1 in 7. The mathematics of it was clean, and the clean mathematics was somehow worse than ambiguity would have been. Maya was in the examination room with a nurse, having been told that the grown-ups needed to talk about her treatment plan, which she had accepted with the patient resignation of a child who understood this as the adult equivalent of not quite ready to tell you yet. She would ask later. She always asked later with the focused directness of someone who had decided that the truth, even when it was hard, was preferable to the particular loneliness of being protected from it. On the drive home, Maya sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the city moving past, and eventually said in the voice she used for serious things, "The doctor looked at me differently today, like she was memorizing something." Caleb watched her in the rearview mirror. "She's deciding the best way to help your heart." "Is it the surgery we talked about?" "Yes, Ladybug." "Sooner than we thought?" "Yes." Maya absorbed this, her eyes still on the window on the city going about its ordinary afternoon. "Okay," she said finally. It was the bravest word he had ever heard spoken. That night, after Maya was in bed later than usual because she'd asked for 2 extra chapters, and both of them had granted it without discussion, Caleb and Isolde stood in the kitchen without speaking for a while. The penthouse had its own nighttime quality. The skyline reduced to its essential light, everything simplified by darkness into something that was almost peaceful if you didn't know what was happening inside the walls. Isolde set a glass of water in front of him, and didn't pretend it was anything other than something to do with her hands. "If something happens to her," she began. "Don't. I need to say it." Her voice was controlled, but the control was visible, the effort showing at the edges. "I've lost everyone I've ever let myself need. I need you to understand that this is not performance. This is the actual thing." She looked at him directly. "If we lose her, I need us to promise something. That we don't let it destroy what we've built. That we hold on to each other especially if the worst happens." Caleb looked at the woman who had built a billion-dollar company on the foundation of a 16-year-old's refusal to be defeated, who had kept a piece of fabric for 20 years as evidence that one good thing had been real, who had learned to make scrambled eggs and memorize a medication schedule and sit on the floor of a child's bedroom reading ahead in the chapter book so she'd know what happened next. He thought about all the ways a person could be brave without anyone seeing the cost. "We're not losing her," he said. "And if I'm wrong, which I'm not, we hold on. We already promised her that. That promise stands regardless of what happens to us." Isolde nodded once, and the nod was a contract more binding than anything filed in any county office. The night before the surgery arrived, the way dreaded things arrived too slowly through the preceding days, and then all at once Tuesday, bleeding into Monday night, bleeding into the 2 o'clock darkness. When Maya appeared in the doorway of their room, her rabbit under her arm, her expression combining sleeplessness and resolve in the particular way of children who had decided to be present for their own fear rather than avoiding it. She climbed into the middle of the bed without asking, which was answer enough about whether asking was necessary. She was quiet for a while, looking at the ceiling with the focused attention she brought to important thinking. Then she reached under her pillow. She'd transferred her things earlier. Caleb realized she'd planned this and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully and held it up in the dim light. 3 dragons. Caleb had seen her working on something over several evenings without registering what it was, the way a parent sometimes missed the thing directly in front of him because he was managing everything around it. Now he looked at it fully. The first dragon was purple with wings that curved upward and a quality of watchfulness in its posture as though it were observing from somewhere elevated and permanent. The second was dark and solid, standing between the other two with its wings spread. The third was the color of a navy night sky, smaller than the other two, but connected to them part of the formation rather than separate from it. In Maya's careful first-grade print along the top, "My family." Along the bottom in slightly less careful letters, as though written quickly before second-guessing could intervene. Mom Lyra says, "Isolde deserves to be loved." Isolde made a sound she didn't finish. Caleb felt something in his own chest that had no name and didn't need one. "I've had this since week 2, Maya said with the directness of someone delivering information that had become newly relevant. "I was waiting for you both to figure it out." She paused. "You're both very smart, but sometimes slow." Isolde laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that arrived through tears, undignified and real, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in 20 years of building walls against exactly this. She pressed her face into Maya's hair and held her with the careful ferocity of someone aware of fragility and unwilling to let it govern them. Maya waited for the moment to settle and then said in a smaller voice, "If I don't wake up tomorrow, you're going to wake up." Caleb's voice was certain in the way that will, rather than probability, could make a voice certain. "But if I don't?" She was not asking permission to say this. She was requiring them to hear it. "I need you both to stay together. Don't let losing me be the thing that breaks you apart. Promise me." The request moved through the room like something that had been waiting for permission to exist. Isolde lifted her head. Her face was entirely without armor, the version of her that had always been there, assembling itself under the CEO and the calculation, and the 20 years of deliberate distance, now simply visible. "We promise," she said. "But you are going to wake up. You're going to tell us about whatever strange dreams the anesthesia gives you, and then you're going to spend 3 months complaining about not being allowed to run, and then you're going to play soccer and be completely insufferable about it." Maya considered this vision of her own future with appropriate seriousness. "I do want to beat Sophia in the 50-yard dash. She's been talking about it all semester." They stayed awake together until the sky began changing, the three of them talking about nothing important and everything important. Maya asking Isolde about what it had been like to be her age, Isolde answering with stories Caleb hadn't heard, the small accumulations of kindness that had kept her functional when the larger systems failed her. Caleb sang the lullaby that had been Lyra's, his voice rough and unpolished, and Maya fell asleep to it at 4 in the morning with her hand still holding the drawing and her breathing steady in the way that was both reassuring and made everything more terrible to contemplate. The surgery was scheduled for 6:30. They arrived at the hospital at 5:15 because there was no sleeping after 4 and no reason to pretend otherwise. The preoperative area was designed for function rather than comfort. Every surface optimized for a purpose that had nothing to do with how it felt to be there. Maya submitted to the IV and the monitoring leads and the purple hospital gown she had asked specifically, and Dr. Wells had arranged it with a stoicism that made Caleb's chest ache in the precise location of every impossible thing he'd ever been required to accept. Dr. Wells appeared at 6:15 in surgical scrubs, carrying the composed authority of a person about to do the thing she was best at in the world. She spoke with Maya, directly explaining in plain terms what would happen and in what order, treating the child's understanding as a given. Maya asked 3 questions, all of them precise, and Dr. Wells answered each with full seriousness. "Ready?" Dr. Wells asked finally. "As much as I'm going to be," Maya said, which was both accurate and more adult than any 6-year-old should have needed to be. They walked alongside the gurney to the surgical suite doors, one on each side, both holding a hand, and Maya looked between them with the expression of someone taking a photograph with their eyes storing the image against whatever came next. At the doors, she looked at Caleb with Lyra's eyes, that particular quality of seeing clearly and not looking away from what was seen. "I love you, Daddy." She turned to Isolde. "I love you, Isolde. If I see Mom Lyra, I'll tell her you're taking good care of each other." Isolde's composure, which had held through all of it, came apart and rebuilt itself in the same breath. "We love you so much," she said, and the simplicity of it was the only thing available that was large enough for the moment. The doors closed. Caleb stood looking at them for a moment that had no particular duration. Then Sterling Cole appeared at his elbow with a phone in his hand and an expression that communicated the specific discomfort of someone bearing news they had not chosen the timing of. Patterson Global had called an emergency meeting. The board was assembling. The question of Isolde's leadership stability was the formal subject. The tabloid and the marriage and everything Victor Holt had put into motion before his own implosion were the real subject. Isolde looked at the phone in Sterling's hand, then at the surgical suite doors. The conflict on her face was the most human thing Caleb had ever seen from her, the agony of a person required to divide their attention between two things that were both total, that admitted no division. He took her hand briefly and she looked at him. "Go," he said. "I'm not leaving her. She can't know you're here for the next 4 hours. But what you've built, she benefits from that. She will benefit from that for the rest of her life." He held her gaze. "Go say what needs to be said. I'll be here when you get back. I'll be here when she's out." The conflict held for 4 more seconds. Then Isolde made the decision that a person with her particular history made when required to choose between the thing that felt right and the thing that was right. She squeezed his hand once and left. Caleb sat in the waiting room and was alone with it. He had sat with bad waiting before the hospital vigils during Lyra's treatment had stretched across months, fear distributed thinly enough to be functional. This was different. This was concentrated into a single room and a single clock and a single set of doors that stayed closed. He couldn't dilute it. He could only sit inside it. He prayed not with the formal architecture of practiced belief, but with the raw directness of a man who needed somewhere to aim the volume of what he felt. He prayed for Dr. Wells's hands, for Maya's small and overworked heart, for the mercy of a future that included her in it. Across the city, in a conference room full of people who had assembled to question whether Isolde Reeves was fit to lead. Isolde did the thing Caleb had done in the boardroom 6 weeks earlier. She told the truth. Not the managed truth, not the version arranged for maximum favorable impression, but the unmediated one. The truth that started with 7 foster families and a Navy jacket and a man who had refused $600,000 because his dignity was not for sale. She told them about Maya, about the surgical suite, about what it meant to build something from nothing and then discover that the thing you'd built was not the most important thing you'd built. She told them she could sign a resignation letter immediately if the board required appearances over substance. And then she said the thing she had never said in 15 years of running this company, in a voice that did not ask permission. "I would give all of it up today, every acquisition, every building with my company's name on it, to keep this family intact. If that reads as a liability to you, then we have different definitions of what leadership costs." The vote was 8-3. She kept her position. Patterson Global's CEO, watching via video link, confirmed that the merger would proceed. She was back in the waiting room at 9:47. She sat down next to Caleb and took his hand, and they didn't speak. The waiting had its own language, and they had both become fluent in it. At 10:53, Dr. Wells came through the doors. Her scrubs were clean. Caleb registered that first, the cleanness of them, the absence of any evidence of crisis. Her face held the practiced neutrality of someone organizing themselves to deliver news clearly, and then that neutrality shifted into something that wasn't neutral at all, something that was the professional version of relief, controlled and real. "She's out," Dr. Wells said. "The surgery went perfectly. The valve repair took exactly as we'd hoped, and the muscle wall reinforcement is solid. She's stable in recovery, and she is going to be completely fine." The release of it was physical. Caleb felt his body process the information before his mind did. His shoulders dropped from a position he hadn't known. They'd been holding something in his chest that had been locked for 4.5 hours, simply opened. Beside him, Isolde pressed her face into her hands and her shoulders shook, and she made no effort to stop them, because there was no one here to perform composure for, and she had run out of reasons to perform it anyway. The recovery room held Maya in a cocoon of monitors and tubes, and the gentle evidence of everything that had been done to save her, and her eyes were open, and when she saw them she smiled with the drowsy completeness of a person who had come back from somewhere far and was glad to find the right people waiting. "Hi." Her voice was scratched from the breathing tube, small and entirely real. "Did you stay the whole time?" "The whole time," Caleb said, which was almost true, and true in the ways that mattered. Maya looked at the ceiling with the half-present gaze of someone still mostly inside anesthesia. "I dreamed about Mom Lyra," she said. "She was holding my hand in the surgery room. She was smiling the whole time." A pause. "She said to tell you both she's proud of how you love each other." The eyelids grew heavy. "She said she can tell that Isolde is the right person." Another pause, sleep pulling harder now. "Is it over? Am I fixed?" "You're fixed." Caleb smoothed her hair from her forehead, the gesture so practiced it lived in his hands rather than his mind. "You're going to be stronger than before, so much stronger." "Good," Maya murmured almost fully under now, her voice arriving from somewhere just at the edge of consciousness. "Because Sophia has been talking about that race all semester and I'm completely done letting her talk." Isolde made a sound between a laugh and a sob and reached across and held Maya's hand, and Caleb watched the two of them, this child who had saved them both in different ways, and this woman who had needed saving for longer than she knew and felt Lyra's presence in the room with the specific quality it always had when something important happened, not haunting, but attending the way love attended things even after the person carrying it was gone. Recovery moved at its own pace, which was slower than anyone wanted and faster than they feared. There were good days and setback days. Days when Maya was fully herself and complained about her restrictions with the complete force of her personality, and days when the pain ran underneath the medication and she was quieter than usual, looking at them with eyes that needed reassurance rather than information. They gave both without being asked, without keeping score. 6 weeks after the surgery, Dr. Wells cleared Maya for full activity, not cautious, not modified, but complete. The life she'd been moving toward through all of it now available without condition. Maya received this news and immediately requested enrollment in the spring soccer league, which was granted, and then prepared for the next 4 weeks with the focused intensity of someone with a specific account to settle. She scored the winning goal in her first competitive game, a left-footed strike that went in off the post, and she ran to the sideline and threw herself at Isolde first, not because she loved Caleb less, but because Isolde was the person who had needed it more, the person who had taken the longest road to this particular field on this particular Saturday afternoon. Isolde caught her and held on, and looked at Caleb over Maya's shoulder with an expression that said everything that couldn't be said, standing on the sideline of a children's soccer field, which was also everything. The months that followed had the texture of ordinary life, which was not a small thing. Ordinary life was what they had been working toward through all of it. The breakfast negotiations and the homework arguments and the Saturday mornings when the kitchen was covered in flour and nobody cared, the evenings when Maya fell asleep on the couch mid-sentence and they carried her to bed without waking her. The quiet hours after she was down when Caleb and Isolde sat with the city doing its patient work below them and talked about nothing important and everything important, and let the silence between sentences be comfortable rather than charged. Victor Holt's federal case concluded in the fall. The conviction carried mandatory sentencing. Caleb's documentation had been the foundation of the prosecution's financial case, which Sterling Cole conveyed without ceremony, with the particular respect of someone who understood what it had cost to assemble quietly and wait. The 2 board members who'd accepted indirect benefits resigned before the proceedings concluded. Aldous Pembridge managed the institutional aftermath with the efficiency of a man who had survived enough organizational crises to understand that the way through was directness rather than management. The CFO offer arrived 7 months after Caleb joined the company. He accepted after 2 days, during which he made a list of what he could actually do in the role and whether it was work he could be proud of, and determined that both answers were straightforwardly yes. The small box had been in his nightstand drawer for 3 weeks before he took it out. Not from uncertainty, he had been certain for longer than he'd been willing to name the way certainty sometimes arrived before you had language for it, and simply waited. He was waiting for the moment to be genuine rather than arranged. It happened on a Saturday morning, which was where their real life primarily lived. Maya was at the table with a project that involved significant quantities of glitter, and a confidence about the glitter that Caleb had learned not to challenge. The light came in at the angle that made the city outside look like the beginning of something. Isolde was standing at the counter with coffee, looking out the window, wearing the particular expression of a person who is simply present in their own life without monitoring it. He set the box on the counter in front of her. She looked at it, then at him, with the expression of a person arriving somewhere they had been traveling toward for a long time without a map. He opened it. The ring was simple, a single diamond, not large, set in platinum, the kind that made its argument through quality rather than spectacle. The kind of ring that Lyra would have approved of, he thought, and the thought arrived without pain, which was itself a kind of measure of how far they had come. "We started with a contract," he said. "I want to end it with a choice. Not obligation, not arrangement, not terms and conditions." He looked at her the way she'd looked at Maya in the schoolyard, the look that didn't leave anything in reserve. "Every day I choose you. Every day. That's what I want this to mean." Isolde looked at the ring for a moment, and every version of her that ran companies and managed boards and maintained the precision of someone who had survived by being harder than what came at her was entirely absent. What remained was the person who had kept a piece of fabric for 20 years, who had sat on a stranger's apartment floor and listened to a child explain the loneliness of dragons as though it were the most important briefing she'd ever attended. "I don't know how to love without being afraid," she said. Her voice was quiet and direct and completely honest. "I've tried to learn it, and I haven't fully managed it." She met his eyes. "But with you, I choose the fear. Every day. That's everything I have to offer, and I'm offering it." It was enough. It was more than enough. Maya looked up from her glitter project and assessed the situation with the comprehensive attention she brought to significant events. "Finally," she announced with the unambiguous satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed across a body of evidence she'd been collecting for months. "I've been waiting for this since week 2. The wedding happened 5 months later on a Saturday in early spring at the same hotel where it had all begun. The choice was deliberate. They had discussed it once and agreed without much debate that the story should close where it opened, that the location carried meaning they didn't want to abandon. Isolde wore navy blue, not as a fashion statement, but as the truest thing she owned, the color of a jacket worn by a 14-year-old who couldn't walk past someone who needed help and had given away the coat off his back in the cold and walked away without asking for anything in return. She had found a way to carry that night forward into this one to make the full arc of it visible. Aldous Pembridge walked her down the aisle, which he'd agreed to with the gruff economy of a man who considered sentimentality a private matter, and then didn't fully succeed at keeping his face composed when the music started, which Caleb noted and appreciated without mentioning. Maya went ahead of them, scattering petals with theatrical commitment, wearing the precise shade of purple that had been her mother's color and was now hers, an inheritance chosen rather than simply received, which made it more completely hers than any other kind could have been. On a small table at the side of the altar, framed simply, was a photograph of Lyra Monroe. Not a memorial, not an apology, but a presence. The recognition that the people who shaped us attended the important moments whether or not we arranged seats for them, and that a family built honestly could hold its full history without being diminished by it. Lyra's laugh was still mid-sentence in the photograph. It always would be. Caleb had written his vows himself, which had taken 3 drafts, and the particular discipline of deciding not to perform the feeling but simply to report it accurately. "I didn't choose how this started," he said, looking at Isolde, the room full of people who had watched this thing being built and understood what it had required. "I choose how it continues. Every morning I wake up and I choose you, and I will keep choosing you until I run out of mornings. I'm not replacing what I had. I'm honoring it by being willing to have more. Love doesn't run out. My daughter taught me that. You showed me it was true." Isolde's vows were shorter, which was consistent with who she was. "I built walls because I didn't believe anyone would stay," she said. You stayed. Maya stayed. I don't know how to rebuild the walls now, and I don't want to. A pause, deliberate and full. Home is a person before it's a place. You were that before I had language for it. When Pembridge pronounced them married, Maya cheered with a volume disproportionate to her size and entirely consistent with her character, and the room laughed, and the crystal caught the light and fractured it across every surface. The same chandelier, the same hotel, the same quality of light that had fallen on Caleb when he'd woken up here with a ring on his finger and no understanding of what it meant. He understood now. The morning after the real, morning after the one that followed a night that had been chosen rather than stumbled into, Maya appeared in their doorway at 6 o'clock with the energy of a child whose heart now worked exactly as it should, effortlessly, without compensation or effort, simply and completely well. She climbed between them and settled in with the easy authority of someone who knew she belonged and looked at the ceiling with the focused expression she brought to things that mattered. "I had a dream about Mom Lyra last night," she said. Caleb pulled her close. "What did she say?" Maya considered this with appropriate gravity, her dark hair loose, the morning light beginning its work through the windows. "She said thank you for loving her right, and for loving each other." A pause. "She said she's happy, that we're allowed to be happy too." Her voice was steady and certain, the voice of someone reporting something they knew to be true. "She also said the purple dragon found her family, in case you were wondering." Isolde reached across Maya, and her hand found Caleb's, and the three of them lay in the early light while the city began its morning. Below them, unremarkable from the outside, entirely transformed within, built from improbable materials by people who had refused to stop building even when they had every reason to stop. On his left hand, the ring sat where it had always sat, the same finger, a different life. Both of them his connected rather than divided. The first one honored in the keeping of the second, which was the only mathematics of love that had ever made sense to him. He had woken up in this building once with that ring and no understanding of what it signified. He understood now that understanding wasn't something that arrived all at once. It was something you built slowly in ordinary kitchens and hospital waiting rooms, and on balconies above cities that didn't know or care what was happening inside the walls day by day, choice by choice, for as long as you were willing to keep choosing. He hadn't turned the lamp off in 9 months. He wasn't going to start now.